Hi, folks. It's Allison. I'm over here on the McDowell chair for a change over by my window in my living room. And I'm just going to do a quick live stream today. I'm kind of processing some stuff, and I thought it would be useful just to put these sort of notes out there because we've got this huge program of discussions around our travels through Arkansas and the Midwest. But sort of buried in there are bunches of bits and pieces. And Jason and I have recorded probably 10 more hours that we haven't screened yet. So I didn't want to wait, and I didn't want to have it sort of embedded in all of this. So I think I called this sort of templated thought fields. And it's linked to a paper that Steffers had shared with me about like the physics of collected consciousness. And I think it's from the 90s. And this guy, he's a Hungarian, Attila Grandpierre, which is quite the name. And it really helped me understand a little bit better about this idea of, Steffers also shared some things around like biophotons and energy fields. And we had been talking about the fascia, the part of your body that's piezoelectric, and this idea that while we perceive our body as like ending at a certain point, like we actually have an energy field, which, we know that, right? Your energy field, your torus, your aura, toroidal field. But even like the biophotons, like we're light beings, right? So we don't actually end where we think we end, and sort of we mingle in with other energy systems, including other people or other beings or other probably machine consciousness, right? I mean, that we all get commingled, and then that makes a field. And there's an energy field to that. And so this paper, it talked a little bit about sort of emotional contagion, and it talked about, especially for children, like, one kid starts crying and then everybody cries, even though the other kids don't have any reason to cry. And, I think about like giggling middle school girls or something like that, like the whole going through the classroom. And so it really was talking, I guess, we talk about egregores, right? And I knew all of these things generally, but this paper really started to crystallize it for me. And again, I have difficulty, communicating with people I love because they don't seem to get it, even though like we're sharing the same language. And I think it actually has to do with the strength of these thought fields that they're in, not simply that they've read propaganda or, certain information that's different than the information I look at, that it's actually an energetic system. And it's not necessarily even something that is targeted from the outside, like someone's, steering a beam at us and like making it a certain way, but like, it's just how we interact with the field, and then how the energy comes through us and projects and then intersects with everyone else. So I found that like a really helpful paper. And so I'm working through a little bit of just my own process of trying to not be so triggered by the fact that the vast majority of people don't understand what we're talking about. And it's been so long, right? Like we're not far out from 4 years of, and then often things that we were talking about 2 or 3 years ago, now they surface, but they surface in a way that they're spun in a different kind of narrative. And so whenever like we tend to be talking about issues, there's a very small group of people that they resonate with, and then most don't. And the reality is that to understand where we're coming from, that you actually have to have a really broad base of information. I mean, I've kind of devoted a good chunk of the last 10, 12 years of my life to understanding this, and there's no shortcut to that really. And a lot of it involves unlearning things you thought to be true, and then figuring out, also refining the aspect of yourself that when you were out in the world doing things that you thought were right in the way of being a good person, you had incomplete information and that those things weren't right. Because then to unlearn things and make room for learning new things, you actually have to, it's a whole process, as I'm realizing, of letting go, grieving for the you that didn't know the things, and then rebuilding yourself in the new way, right? And it's a process, not easy. It takes time. And so we're in this world of digital information that everything is like quick and fast. And, I want to know it immediately. And then we pivot to the next topic. And then we do that for a little bit. And then we pivot to the next. And it's this very jarring thing. And so nobody has time to say like, hey, I know people have said, Allison, you need to write a book. And I might write a book eventually, but I don't think I'm to the point of understanding it well enough to know what book I would need to write. And so, maybe if there was a book someone could sit down and read, and that would encapsulate that 10 or 12 years, then they would have that information and they could see where I'm coming from. But a lot of, so I'm trying not to be triggered. A couple days ago, I had shared a 2.5 minute clip from University of UC Santa Cruz. And that's the place where Michael Matthias, if you watched our videos Jason and I did, the talks about, do you want to play a game? It was about incorporating AI into online dialogue and game mechanics. And then ultimately, I think that will be linked into mixed reality and like live action role play gaming. And so that's pretty disturbing because they were talking about the training data being like Sex and the City and Mean Girls, or how they were modeling their reactivity. So that's not good. And so the same UC Santa Cruz was doing another clip where it was tween girls, predominantly girls of color, like girls from low-income communities, and they were brought in to work on costumes with wearable technology, like internet sensing technology, to do quest-based learning activities as a group. So it's many themes that I've been talking about, like teaming, sensor networks, systems engineering, like complex emergent systems, competency-based education, impact finance with girls of color, low-income, as an impact commodity. All of these things kind of came together. And I incorporated it into one of the talks that I'm going to give. And I put these things up, I put them out there. And I presume that people who, are checking in on my channel, they do, like I come to have a quirky channel. So I kind of figure people would dig into what it is, like in the context of what I've been talking about, like for themselves, because this is not me just telling you, this is us thinking together. And, for the most part, again, the comments were just emotionally reactive. And one in particular said, like, I'm really troubled. I can't really watch. It's hard for me to watch this because of the girls are all wearing masks. And to me, that's a symptom. Like if we have enough self-reflection on what we've gone through during the lockdowns in terms of cognitive domain management, right? And most of us didn't know because we never lived through overt global psychological warfare. Maybe we'd lived through covert, consumer culture psychological warfare, but not overt. We didn't know what it was, right? And so it takes you a while to get your sea legs, and you have some experience, and then you reflect on that experience, and then you recalibrate based on your lived experience and like what you know, right? So I consider the past 3.5 years to be like a front seat on cognitive warfare, right? In all of its manifestations on all of us, including and maybe especially the resistance. And so reflecting on that process, and I said, listen, if that's where you're at, like you get triggered by mask and then you stop and then you assign a judgment value to that, and then you don't actually explore these larger things that are, to me, far more compelling about teaming, game-based education, consciousness, sensor networks, like they've won, because essentially you feel superior because you put a judgment call on some performative behavior that you've seen. But literally they've put a roadblock like on your consciousness at that point, and you're not going to go any further. And that keeps you at the surface. And so you're continually reactive. You're just reactive. And you're not actually getting at the core of what these bigger issues are. What is the nature of this current, right? And so the back and forth, and again, digital media is not great, but the first person's reaction, like I'm entitled to my reaction. And I'm like, you certainly are entitled to that reaction, but you need to understand that you've been conditioned in that reaction, not just you, millions of people, to see a thing like a mask and then to be triggered emotionally and then to end up and to land in a hard stop space and to place a judgment and then to back away because you don't like that's enough. You simply categorized it and then you feel superior about it and then you don't do anymore. And that's a thing. And that's a way of being in the world that ultimately advantages the system that's rolling everything out, because it keeps you at this very basic reactive emotional level. And so we kind of went back and forth, and they literally, like, their whole thing was just like, I'm entitled. This is a good reaction. I'm like, I'm not saying everybody's allowed to react how they do, but you should self-reflect. I'm trying to tell you that this is not going to get us where we need to be. It's to sit in this reactive judgment mode. It's just not, in my opinion, like that, like it'll just keep you where you are. You'll be comfortable in that place and you'll just be reactive and superior and you won't be going anywhere, right? And so for me, I had just read all about these collective thought forums, and that's a Pavlovian digital conditioning device that has been waged. And think about all the different trigger things that the resistance has been conditioned to over time, they can just push your button, keep you exactly where you are. And again, I'm not saying, because I was reacting to their reaction, so I'm not saying I'm outside of the loop. Like, yes, I too was triggered. So it's a cascading, like we're all triggering each other, right? Which is also not great. So I'm still trying to work through this. So eventually I kind of gave up and I said, listen, if you want to get what I'm talking about with this clip, you're going to have to read this 40-page paper and look at these clips, and look at this context, because this is important. Like, here's my map and here's the paper. Like, you're going to have to read the 40-page paper to get what I'm talking about. You can't just immediately have some fast pass emotion thing, because it's not going to work. And then at that point, it kind of broke through the thought field and they said, oh, okay, yeah, thank you. Like, I get that now. Like, I get there is a meaning to this. And it's not like we're simply struggling over who's entitled to have what feeling. I'm like, you're entitled to have the feeling, but just have enough perspective on the next time you're triggered like that. Like, what is it doing? And is there more? Is that where they want to keep you? So anyway, so I had that. And then yesterday, and I swim in all of this information, right? And I guess we all do. I mean, a lot of people are being fed through digital feed streams. At this point, most of the stuff I get is from sort of a small group of people, and we're comparing notes, not in a main flow of the big social media feeds. And so I had, had some back and forth with Steffers about different things. And at some point last week, when I was making my map, I realized that our former school superintendent of Philadelphia Public Schools, William Haidt, for quite a number of years, like, it's probably, not to feed into the bad energy, but like in my headspace where I was then, he would be like my nemesis, right? And he was, he is a tall, bald, sophisticated Black man, very smooth, very much the operator, right? And he was in the Philadelphia Public Schools for almost 10 years. And I remember back to the situation that triggered my initial activism, which was in the 2013, the closure of all these schools in Philadelphia and the disruption of everything, and being in the school board building in this big auditorium at these 8 top tables. And parents were saying, oh my gosh, they're, it's so bad. And the rooms are packed. And our kindergarten class, the teacher, there's no room for her desk in the room. It's just, the desk has to be in the hall. And at that point, I was just vaguely waking up and I'm like, it's on purpose, people. Like, this didn't just happen. This is on purpose. And I was trying to speak out about, I can't remember, it might've been about Dell or some of the things I had found out about the ed tech and things. What at the time I only understood it as privatization and maybe, data surveillance. And he stood up and he looked at me and he goes, I know you. I know where your child goes to school. And granted, my child was in a public magnet school. So I think the implication was, shut up because you don't have any room to talk, because all these parents are from other less funded schools. But my position was, it was the families in the magnet schools that should be using our social capital to speak out and advocate on behalf of all the other kids, right? I mean, it is what it is. I mean, the Philadelphia Public School, it was a game to play, right? And in retrospect, I don't know exactly how the choices that we made, how they ultimately all worked out. But there was this tension. And I almost have a sense at the time that William Haidt knew more about me and my energy than I did about myself. Like, I didn't know that about myself at the time, but I think he dialed in. So anyway, so last week I find out that in 2018, I gave testimony to the school board because I had discovered something called Ridge Lane. And Ridge Lane is a merchant venture banking firm. I encourage you to look it up. I think I don't know if it's Ridge Lane LP or Ridge Lane LLC. You can look it up, but Ridge is Tom Ridge, former Pennsylvania governor, but also the first head of Department of Homeland Security. And this other guy, Brad Lane, who I don't know who Brad Lane is. On the pictures, he looks like he's like 24, 25. But he holds some visiting scholar appointment at Stanford for indefinitely. And they don't tell you, in the School of Education, they don't tell you what it is. So I gave this testimony and I said, and this, if you go to their advisors group, so they're investing in energy, sustainability, real estate, and education. And it's a for-profit company. It's a venture capital company. And so I and they were closing down Strawberry Mansion High School, and they were putting in some energy curriculum and all this stuff. And Strawberry Mansion is in North Philly, so it's a community that was redlined and disinvested in, and things that were happening in the high school were happening outside the neighborhood, and their participation, they were really upset about it. And so I was speaking to that, and I said, listen, this community has really serious concerns, because here you are, you're actually advising, you're on the advisor list of the website of this organization that's doing real estate, because it was clearly going to be a setup for gentrification, and education investing and energy investing. Like, these are all things that are tied to this issue that's before the school district, the school boards, school reform commission at the time. And I'd just like to know, are you in fact an advisor to Ridge Lane? Because they could always say, oh, I don't know how he ended up on the website. He's not actually an advisor. But I got him, and I said, so if you look at the advisors in 2018, and then I've been going back through, there's like 100 of them, over a dozen former governors, bipartisan, many high-level military, high-level technology, key people who are key in advancing new education policies, shift towards proficiency-based education, ed tech, future schools, all of that stuff. And yeah, so he had to admit that he was, and like the legal team is like scrambling, right? And they're like, but he just participates on a couple phone calls a week, a month, and they're working on jobs for whatever. And so I revisited that, because I'm like, oh, now I understand, because now Height, after 10 years, which again, most school superintendents don't stay in urban school districts more than 3 years, because the whole goal is disruption and instability. So you'll have one and they'll do it for a couple of years, and then they'll move on, and then you'll start over and mess up all the programs. And like, there's no stability. So for him to be in Philly for almost 10 years, that was really unusual. But this past week, I found out that now he's over at KnowledgeWorks, and KnowledgeWorks is in Cincinnati, and that's the core, NGO that is setting up the competency-based education, the badges, the XAPI, and then they spun out Strive Together, which is the cradle to career human capital impact investing, program. And so it's very significant to me, because also KnowledgeWorks, like if we had a human nemesis, it would be Height. And if I had a institutional nemesis, it would be KnowledgeWorks. And so, yeah, now they've converged right in the same place. And KnowledgeWorks has, this new report where it's called like I Learn, and it's all about future ready, diverse, just schools. But, the kids are supposed to have their wearable virtual life coach, that lives in a stuffed animal, and then it lives as a bracelet, and then it's smart of their smart glasses. And, and it's super creepy, all of the stuff that's planned, because now I realize, as I'm dealing more with the field and synchronicity and consciousness, that I think that these wearables are ultimately about activating thought fields and activating into the collective subconscious for computing. And that may sound far out, but I invite you to look into biological computing. The body is a computer, like the most sophisticated technology. And our consciousness is as an interface between the quantum field, especially the minds of children, the imaginative minds of children. And so there were a couple other papers. So the other thing is, and I need to get back to this, but Lynn and I were doing a whole series of talks on open education resources in the spring, because that's rolling out in Austin tied to Learn Capital. And the guy who was heading up Learn Capital shortly after landed at the Vatican, and they were having a whole program at the Vatican for EdTech. So I have a whole series of the conversation we did around the Vatican, but I haven't put it out yet. And so I need to revisit that. But when I went to the Ridge Lane website, they actually have a tab called Our Credo. Now, it doesn't say our mission or our values. It says Our Credo. So I click on that, and I don't know that I'd ever clicked on it before. And they have a very slick website. And the way the pages are templated, like the top half has a big feature photo, and then the bottom half has text. And the bottom half had the text, what you would expect, venture capital, social impact, data-driven metrics, like all of the things that you need for cybernetic human capital investing. But the top half literally was a musical score in Latin. And I'm like, what is that? What is that? And So I'm trying to look it up, like trying to Google the words because it was only like 2 lines on one. It was like it had taken like the top half of a sheet. So it was like the beginning and then the end, the top of the beginning and then part of the top of the end. But I finally found it, and it was the Tridentine Creed from like 1563 Pope Pius IV. So this merchant banking company that's dealing in sustainability, real estate, energy, and education, their credo, all about impact investing, literally the future photo they chose is the Tridentine Creed, which was at the time, I guess, the church's codification of their belief systems in opposition to the early beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. Very strange choice, guys. I mean, unless clearly we understand that the Vatican, among others, is deeply involved in stakeholder capitalism and in investing in making these investments, especially in children. And you've got the Catholic Relief Services, and I think Patricia Dineen of the Boston Archdiocese, and she's the head of the venture capital philanthropy, people. This is all coming through, right? Like this is all coming out. And at the time, I did not have a sense of, okay, how are they going to get around Moore's law, right? They're bumping up against like mathematical computation. And like, how can they keep getting these profound efficiencies by getting smaller? They're like hitting the wall. And speaking of thought forms, I mean, it seems like now everyone's talking about biodigital convergence, right? And that's the thought form. That's in the field. That's a word. And then everybody uses that word. Not everybody, but like that's the word of the month or the word of the week or whatever, and it's in the field. And I think that's how it works in consciousness. Now, Steffers and Steffers has that wonderful, life of an engineered nanoparticle at a piece of mindful. And, was tweeting like crazy about Ian Achilles at Georgia Tech and the Internet of Bio-Nano things. That was, easily early 2021, right? But only now is it coming into the field as an acceptable thought form. And then that thought form like crystallizes, and then that's the lens everybody uses together to look at the thing. But there's not a lot of, I'm finding it seems like the tendency, and I'm not saying it's not human, but is to latch onto one thing and then apply that broadly, as opposed to sort of being able to shift in and out of different lenses and sort of see how they go together, right? Because everyone agrees this is what we talk about this week. We're talking about this topic, and then that's the thing. In fact, I had someone that was like another triggering tiff and like a comment, but they're like, well, maybe you should talk more about Gaza and point fingers to the people, shine the light on the people who are doing the lockdowns and things. And I'm like, well, you can do that. Like you can totally go and have your own channel and do that. But I'm not going to sign up for the 24/7 trauma drama thing, because I know what that is, and I'm doing my thing over here. So I'm not going to come over, you make a thing and tell you have to, change how you're doing it to please me. But it's like this week we talk about this topic. This is the topic. And so I know about this topic. And if I'm going to engage, I'm not going to engage necessarily with all the content that you just put out and respond to it. I'm going to try to drag you back into the thought field that we're in, right? You can't talk about gamified, mixed reality and synchronicity, because like the thought field says that we're doing Gaza now, right? But the thought field said, we're doing biodigital convergence now. And we don't reflect on like 2 years ago what people were talking about it. We just talk about it in this temporal moment. And it's weird. Like I'm trying to kind of get a handle on this consciousness field and how it actually works. So the other thing about, like when we think about Austin, the Knowledge Works, like a couple years ago, had a big gathering about like effective grant making. And of course, effective grant making is data-driven grant making. And they had gathered in Austin for this important conference about, philanthropy, right? Data-driven philanthropy, which is going to like link into biodigital convergence, but we don't have to use that word per se. But so they were talking, and Blue Meridian Partners, which is really active in Dallas, they were presenting on all the human capital stuff they were doing in Dallas with Commit. And there was somebody, the Ewing Kauffman Foundation from Kansas City, and they were there talking about something. And then Knowledge Works was talking about their work in North Dakota on competency-based education. But they were in Austin, so that big conference. And Austin is such a center for supercomputing and education. And, at the time, And you only know what you know when you know it. But like I was envisioning it as privatization or educational technology surveillance and using children as free labor, digital labor. But I think ultimately that supercomputing attached to children is going to be linked to biocomputing. And I think that the biocomputing isn't simply the materiality of like using your body as a bioreactor, but it's literally about like using nanotechnology, non-surgical, BCI to essentially parasitize your interface with the field, right? And then doing that, focusing on young children, right? Early childhood impact investing, because they actually have the most imagination and the most access to the field. And so like within Austin, one of the things that I had also found out was this guy, Hal Puthoff, I think. I've been looking a lot into Operation Stargate and remote viewing, and linked to the Society for Psychical Research. And like in my talks, I was talking about the Curie's ties to the Society of Psychical Research in England, and Arthur Balfour and Arthur Cohen, like these very elite people doing scientific research into speaking to the dead or telepathic communications. And that came into the US and through JB Ryan at Duke, the Duke Parapsychology Lab, which is still actually functioning, although no longer directly affiliated with Duke. And they're working on ESP and telepathy. So yeah, then it links into remote viewing. And this guy, Hal Puthoff, who is one of like the prime military intelligence remote viewers. And this was all through the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was super advanced in their parapsychology research. And I think ultimately it's because Vladimir Vernadsky, the guy who was advancing the noosphere and the biosphere, that he was collaborating with the Curies and they were doing psychical research. So if you understand the noosphere as something that has a telepathic psychic, like an interface into the field, it seems pretty clear to me that a lot of the Soviet focus on parapsychology probably came out in some respect, was informed by Vernadsky's experience, right? So they were super advanced. And there's a book by this guy, Jonathan Moreno, who's a bioethicist at Penn, called Mind Wars. And his father was Jacob Moreno, who was involved in sociometry and psychodrama. And he talks a lot about the parapsychology research in the Soviet Union. So yeah, so we're doing ours because it's an intelligence race. It's a race to, like, I mean, if you can do, like, if you don't need to train a spy to physically go somewhere and you can simply tap into the field and see what people are doing from a distance without threat to your own safety, like, of course you're going to do it, right? And then you're going to make fun of it in public, right? That man who stare at goats or whatever Jason was telling you about that. You're going to make it sound silly. But you're going to embed it in SRI International, which is, where the first, transmission of the internet landed, right? And so Hal Puthoff was one of the people who was closely attached to that program, and he ended up landing in Austin. And he's been running his own like Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin and something called like Earth Tech since the 80s, 85. Right. And so now you've got Austin, you've got Learn Capital, you have educational technology, you have a lot of work advancing around wearable tech, EEG tech that was, coming out of Harvard, the brain bands. And a lot of them are being sold as interventions for kids with like sensory issues or autism issues or whatever, like biofeedback. And so I'm just sort of looking at all of these things. Now, so there were a couple other papers, a couple other things that came to me. One is Steffers put this person on my radar, Dana Klisanen. She's a Saybrook University graduate, and she runs this thing. She's in Arkansas called Rewilding the Mind, and she's all about game-based learning and transpersonal psychology. And so she studied under this guy, Benathi, who is a systems theorist, and her dissertation was around Benathi's idea of a media interface for guided evolution. Now, if we go back and we look at like Irvin Laszlo and Julia Stillman and Maslow and all of that, like they're all about the human potential movement is guided evolution. Barbara Marx Hubbard, like all of the New Agers, they're pulling people through into that space. And she was working with her sister who was connected. Her niece was at a school called Quest to Learn, which was play-based learning funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And again, as a parent who went through being like led around by the nose, like this is when I say you're being triggered so that you're being misdirected to look the other way or stop and not go deeper, it's because I've had these experiences myself. I'm saying this from experience. I'm not saying I'm better. I'm saying, like, let me tell you how it works. They'll give you something to do to keep you busy, to feel like you won. Meanwhile, they're rolling out the bigger program like right behind your back and you didn't notice, right? So play-based learning, expeditionary learning, which is going to be the antidote to standardized testing and rigid curriculum and all of this stuff. As soon as they get smart uniforms and sensors in the sneakers and EEG headbands and smart watches, sure, they'll send kids out to forest school. That's where they want the kids. They want the kids interfacing their consciousness with the field, with the richness of the other beings outside of a school building. That's what LRNG is for MacArthur. So MacArthur Foundation was funding this Quest to Learn school in New York. And it had a lot of elite backing between people who were connected to AI and a lot of other stuff. So anyway, so that's Clissanen, and she was really talking about, she had something called Project Milky Way. And again, we keep coming back to space. These charter schools keep being called things that are related to like rockets and Stargate and space travel, right? So she's got this Project Milky Way. Now, I don't know if Quest to Learn was going to be a test bed for Project Milky Way, but in that, what she was advancing was empathy and linking the global north, global south, and through game mechanics, and it was a digital game, and that she anticipated that it would run through like the like MIT Media Lab, Negroponte, One Laptop, One Child, which is something that my friend Sean in Washington has been doing a lot of, right? And she was really interested in improving morality. So we're going to start hearing the moral economy. That's going to be ESG, but it's also going to be like your inner development. This is human potential, right? And that they wanted to have a portal so where people could work together, global South kids and global North kids, right? And then there would be an economy, and the kids would have digital wallets that they could earn points and turn it into currency and then do social impact investing in the game. And that they would fund this through advertising in game with benefit corporations. So like when the characters in the game had to refuel, they could go and choose from among benefit corporation organic energy bars, right? Like you could have the 5 different B Corp organic energy bar food, right? And then they could advertise in the game, and that's how you would fund it, or foundations would fund it. And then the kids were supposed to evolve themselves morally by participating in social impact investing in the game, in this gaming economy. And then they would have this governance portal that they would have these connections. And so for me, all of these things that kept streaming back was that I knew that the UN had been doing a lot of work in virtual reality empathy training. And a lot of it was around humanitarian aids, so that they would put you like, here, walk through a refugee camp. And then you would have empathy, which doesn't mean, like, to me, I didn't understand, like, why would you have to walk through a refugee camp to have empathy for refugees? Like, you can have empathy for them without having to actually encounter it, or it would be like anti-bullying or racism or these things. But what I'm realizing is that I think the empathy training is actually, well, one, it's a trauma. It's like you're being traumatized. It's like a shock within this trauma delivery system. And then there's an entrainment, because the data goes both ways, and you can get your energetic signature. So I think ultimately there's when I go back to talking about this collective consciousness thought field, I think that the wearables are going to be part of the entrainment process, whether it's an entrainment of your gut frequency or heart frequency or mind frequency. But these frequencies, I think, are going to start to be regulated like a biofeedback device. And that's something, Ben Goertzel talked about, when the woman's like, let me, tell how do we share our consciousness with the forest? And Ben's like, well, I like walking with out in the forest, but it's very different than typing on a computer. But maybe sometime we'll have like smart clothes, and it'll like give us biofeedback about how to be in the forest. And that's what's coming, right? Like, you're going to have this biofeedback. And so these wearables are going to be in training collectivity. And I believe it is for biocomputation. And I know it may sound outlandish, but like, bioreactors are a thing. Like, why are we using yeast and other little beings to become fabricators of other materials? Right. I mean, part of the issue with nanotechnology when they first conceptualized it was the problem of fat fingers, sticky fingers, that that because of the physics in the material world, something that small, you couldn't put it together because it would just like the scale didn't work. Like, we didn't actually, they imagined you could do 3D printing like CAD and, type up something at a nanoscale and just have a 3D nano printer. But the physics didn't work with the sticky fingers, fat fingers thing. But then they figured out, how you could do it. You just put it in biology and then you have a self-assembly system. So they're doing that in yeast. They're doing, like all of this. they're using the bioreactors that already and at tiny organisms. But you could imagine that they're not necessarily going to stop with small organisms. And so this other paper that Sephir's put on my radar, her name is Gordana Vitaliano, and she was connected to something like the McLean Psychopharmacology Institute at Harvard, associated with Harvard Medical School. And they're connected to addiction treatment. All right. So Gordana Vitaliano, again, she's a medical doctor and a PhD and a psychiatrist, and she does nanostructure design. And she works on nanotherapeutics that are self-assembling and they get past the blood-brain barrier. But there's a whole other paper that was sent to me that dates to 2000, where essentially she was talking about NLP, NeuroLinguistic Programming, I think it is. And a lot of it was about therapeutic treatment using sort of NLP, which I'm assuming it seems to involve, I don't know if it always involves a hypnosis component, or a meditative component. But a lot of the case studies, she seemed to indicate that there was a base level hypnotism, or like getting your consciousness in a different wave state, that they were doing these interventions. But the paper opened literally by talking about this subconscious state as highly, highly efficient computing, that like normal conscious processing happened at a certain rate, but in the subconscious, it was maybe 10 times faster. And I believe what they're looking at is to try to coordinate that process. I think that's where we're at. And that there's going to be some sort of, I mean, she, literally in this woman, Gordana Vitaliano's bio, they say that she's building nano robots, right? And Melanie Swan is talking about in 2016, the cloud mines and blockchain and neural nanobots. So you can, I keep saying, like, if we're thinking about kids and human capital, I believe it's about biocomputation. And you go back even with Claude Shannon in World War II at Bell Labs, the first computers were women. Like, they did the mathematical computation, and the humans were the computers. And I think we're looping back. And so, so that's coming up. And then, if you link that with remote viewing and imagination and the nano robots and the educational technology. And then this other paper that came up was about using image processing to assess one's human biofield. Now, these are scientists. This is not like some, what you call like write off as a new age thing, whatever. Somebody wants to sell you, a Himalayan salt crystal lamp. No, these are scientists, and they're talking about using automatic image processing to scan people's biofields and then introduce sonic restorative frequencies, right? Essentially to shift your biology by reading your chakras and then sending you a prescription energy field back. And to me, it's not at all clear that that's something we even know is happening, or we consent to, or that we ask for, right? And so we have that. And then ultimately today, I was bringing back to the whole thing about looking at Gordon and Betty Moore. They were funding a lot of STEM education initiatives, but then Gordon Moore helped create the first processor semiconductor, and then he worked for Intel. And so the whole Moore's law, that everything keeps getting smaller and smaller and faster, that was Gordon Moore. Lots and lots of money into cancer research, lots of money into STEM, lots of money into emergent physics and discovery, right? And so we're talking about complex systems. Um, and I kept trying to go back and find, because I'm pretty sure that they gave some money to early childhood education, and they're tied in with the California grant making institutions and Caltech. Lots and lots of money to Caltech for nano. And then also really active in California is the CAV Foundation. And he was Norwegian. I can't remember how he made his money, maybe car parts. And he's deeply funding theoretical physics research. And there's a whole Kavli physics research program at University of California, Santa Barbara. And so if you look at the among the course offerings at UC Santa Barbara, it includes nano, it includes game science, it includes evolutionary psychology. It includes all of these socio-technical systems that would link to a biological, psychic, and computer through an entrainment with one another as a collective consciousness into the field. And so I'm not saying that that's definitely the case, but for me, this is what happens. Is like I land in a bunch of papers, right? A few of them I find on my own. A lot of them I'm in a shared space with other people, and we're laying things down and we're comparing back and forth. And then I have serendipitous things that tap into my lived experience, which was like, oh, wow, Bill Haidt is now at KnowledgeWorks, and let me go back and think about all of those things and what that means going forward. I have these relationships, right? I have a friendship with Lynn, and we know what she's navigating in terms of Texas education privatization. But for the most part, those people are operating on the surface level, not because they're stupid, but they just don't know, and they don't have the framework. So I guess in closing, I was trying to have like a conversation with someone who was really aware of energy field parasitization, like parasites, and how that works. Because I need to figure out how we talk about this, because some of what I've been talking about with Jason from the Arkansas trip is this idea of Umwelt, how you sense the world, how we're going to struggle over how we sense, right? So right now, my sense making is kind of framed by a small group of collaborators, right? And instead of the massive deluge feed that most people are. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, it's just different, right? So we're trying to figure out, how do we sense into the digital world? What is our apparatus of sensing? Now, the UNESCO and all those people want to give you tokens and trust tokens and blah, 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 and give you lenses and filters and things like that. But how do we sense our Umwelt? And then how do we make meaning of it and talk about it? Like, how do we develop a language for it? Because so much of this is actually linguistics, and a shared language that we actually, when we use a concept, everybody knows what it is. And for me, this loops back to templating consciousness, right? Like the person who saw the masks, who reacted a certain way, their consciousness was templated in a certain way. And I'm saying in some ways it's perfectly human, because we deal with so much information. It's important for us to make shortcuts. We wouldn't operate in the world if we didn't have shortcuts. We have to think through every single thing we do in the day. We just wouldn't get out of bed. So I get it. But then the next thing is, if we have to invent a new language for talking about the world that is unfolding, a world that would have 5 or 10 years ago seemed unbelievable, right? That you could be using biological computing to access a quantum thought field to surpass Moore's law for high biohybrid computation in the world brain, in this noosphere that has been anticipated since at least, the early 20th century. And that it may have a telepathic or psychic component or some other sensory component that we're not prepared to really talk about in a serious way, because we're taught to make fun of it and think it's silly, right? Remote viewing silly, like psychic stuff silly. But that seems to be where it's going. And then the children are in the mix of all of that, right? The children who are going to be told, hey, don't you just want to put on this headband and play my social impact game? I think you'll turn out to be more moral, and you can see how, and, a lot of this stuff is going to be picked up by the resistance, because they're like, oh, no, government schools, right? But they'll play a game, a libertarian game or a Christian game or some other kind of game that feels comfortable to them, because all of what we've been doing for the past, since Facebook probably, is building up a digital twin so that the system can tell us a story that we feel that validates our lived experience and that makes us feel empowered choosers, and then invites us in. And then we'll think that we're resisting, but really we're just running right into the middle of it. So yeah, so I had, I guess this is all by way of sort of saying, I'm trying to figure out how to deal with the idea of a templated consciousness and make my peace with it. Because, I mean, somebody today asked sort of like, let's see. I guess it was like they didn't really know what I was doing. Like they wanted, like, am I here to help people understand or something like that? And I kind of have made it clear that now that I see these thought forms, I don't know how to get into them. Like I can't actually claw my way into somebody else's thought form. I can't claw into my child's thought form. I can't claw into the people that I used to do education activism with and their thought form and try to like scratch out a hole and like inject my semiotics into that space. It doesn't work, actually. It doesn't work. So my current trajectory is I'm mostly exploring because I feel driven to do it for me. I do these things publicly because I feel like, and I do occasionally get feedback from people that it helps them make sense of things. But the people for whom it helps them make sense, it's not because I specifically targeted them. It's because whatever the resonance worked. Like we were entrained, and I'm not saying like in an evil way, like, but our resonance is on the same frequency. And so like I get triggered because sometimes it's hard being essentially having this huge glom of information, like I just said, there's like, like, I don't know, a bunch, all these different papers, right, that I'm looking at and talking about and thinking about. Now, there's not many people out there who would have read all 6 papers and synthesized them and compared them and then compared them against their lived experience the way I would compare it, and then have a same basis that we can talk about, like play with the ideas about. Because that's a huge commitment of work to say, like, I think you should read 7 papers today before we can actually have the conversation. It doesn't, especially in the speed of the internet, it doesn't really work that way. And I can't expect that from people. So I just have to do it and then put it out there. And then where the energy finds its way in, often in across time and space and distance where I don't even know, that it makes sense. And then that it works for those people. But in this instance today, it was someone who I thought, again, based on everything I understood, that they would totally get what I was talking about when I was asking about like saying, like placing the biofield tuning and the aura, after I had talked about this idea of you tapping into the collective, the subconscious through this NLP nanotech person, that space, especially because she was working in addiction. So think again about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and him setting up the San Patrignano, right? Setting up these small community therapeutics. Those are going to be thought forms. Those are going to be nodes of biohybrid computation. Though that's, I mean, I'm very clear. I feel like it's very unlikely he's going to be president, but he could totally be tapped for some sort of high-level health and human service division to deal with addiction and set up these computing nodes, right? And then this woman is also dealing with dementia. So those are people who are interfacing with the field, because I think too, in addiction, a lot of people self-medicate because they have a frequency, a way of being in the world that doesn't conform to mainstream society. So they self-medicate to make themselves fit in. So if you've got a mind that is non-traditional, that's an attractive unit. Like you're going to go after those people. And then if you can experiment on them, for the most part, people are so at their wits' end on how to deal with addiction, much of which was manufactured on purpose by the pharmaceutical companies. Like you're kind of going to try everything if nothing has worked, right? And then if you do stuff to people and they try to tell you that crazy things happen to them, they'll be like, well, you're just an addict. We don't have to believe you. You were probably high, or you're manic depressive. You were probably just hallucinating. Right. And so they've got, and the same thing, like, again, my dad had Alzheimer's. Like, I don't know what they're planning on doing with their nano robots in the subconscious. I mean, maybe there's something super important about people in dementia. Like I said, this woman that I connected with early on, she was a professor and she was looking at social impact bonds in the elderly space. And she was taking care of her elderly father who had dementia issues. And she was indigenous. And she said, in our way of being, that the children and the elders are closer to the spirit world. Like, that's how we understand it. And they come and go in and out. Right. And so it was kind of said as a way to help me process like the sadness of that. Losing your physical capacity in this world isn't necessarily always a terrible thing. It's just a different thing, right? They're moving into another dimension. And I think that this computation is part of that. So anyway, I had put out a few things to someone who, based on in a space that I had been invited into and that was built for a conversation that was built around having my voice be part of the conversation. And I was laying these things out. And the initial response to the biofield was essentially something like, oh, so they're going to link your aura to your social credit score. And I will agree that I was triggered by that, because to me, it was not unlike my experience with the person. I put out something that was material that had really sophisticated implications to it. The girls and the teens and the wearables and the LARPing and the gaming and the consciousness. And the reaction was, oh, masks. I know what that is. Put it in a box, bad. Now and then move on to the next thing in my feed. And that's what it felt like. I'm like, this is important. This idea of NLP, efficient processing, computational processing, and then this other piece about biofields, because to me, it's about the entrainment. And my gut reaction was, we're so emotionally reactive, and that we want to make sense of things. And then sometimes we just don't have time. Like, I know Steffers often is a gold mine of information, but I can't, and Sean too, I can't absorb all of it immediately. We just have actually in these bodies a limited capacity. So sometimes I overlook and I don't get to it. And I don't respond as quickly. But the idea of a compartment, it was like an encapsulation. I know this thing feels uncomfortable. I'm going to encapsulate it with another thing that feels uncomfortable, like a social credit score. And that's going to help me sort out this thing so I can move it over on the shelf and move on to the next thing. And I don't think that person consciously thought of it that way, but I feel like these shortcuts of the resistance, I think that's what the World Economic Forum was about. You will own nothing and you will be happy. You will eat bugs, blah, 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 blah. Those are short circuits. I described it as a box canyon. I said, I think that social credit score thing is a box canyon. And I think a lot of these phrases are box canyons, right? They give you a shorthand to dismiss and set aside. And what I'm saying is, like, we may not always have all of the capacity to engage with the material at the time. I get that. I also don't have that much, like, you hit your wall, right? But the idea of putting a pin in it and holding it for later, or even acknowledging that, like, I don't know exactly what to do with it right now, but I'm going to put a pin in it and I'll think about it. Maybe I'll come across something in our subconscious, because our subconscious is amazing, right? I'm going to go for a walk and see something, and it's totally going to resonate with this piece. And I'm going to understand how to make sense of it. I'm going to be able to, like, contribute to the puzzle solving space that we're all in, rather than this box canyon thing. And again, I think this person was triggered by my tone, like, oh, that means you're insufficient. But what I meant was, it was a rote response. It was like the guy saying, I see a mask and it's bad, so I can't watch it. It short circuited the investigation. And I'm not saying that makes this person, bad. It was just, in that moment, it was insufficient. And so I think people would like for me to have this lovely tone of always being like the kind and generous and hand-holding, whatever. But, like, guys, I can't do that all the time. Like, there's part of me that's kind of wrecked that so many people, even people I thought were close with me, who have qualifications based on, like, as I understand their lived experience, that would make them good players in the space to compare notes with, who literally are not getting it. And I'm not even saying it's personally their fault, but I get frustrated because it's hard being out here and like, this is important, right? Bill Hite, KnowledgeWorks, Austin, the Vatican, whatever the credo, remote, wearables, remote viewing, telepathy, quantum computing, nanorobotics, Moore's law, biofield tuning, entrainment. It's all super important. And we need a language to talk about it. I mean, I think that was the other thing. Like, I'm going to bounce back and like just say, well, I don't really see how, this person, like, that biocomputing is a counterpoint to authoritarianism. Because realistically, and I get that, they're not in my brain, right? They haven't listened to hundreds of hours of me. Now, I'm not telling people to listen to hundreds of hours of me. It's probably exhausting. I never even thought I would be doing this. Like, I would not even be doing these videos if Jason hadn't showed up and said, we need to do videos, because that's what Jason's good at, is videos. And clearly we've moved into a world where everything's videos. I don't want to say, like, you should spend the quality years of your life listening to this woman sitting in her row house in Philadelphia. That would be extremely presumptuous and probably really misguided. But the reality is like, no one can see where I'm at because they haven't swum in all these waters. And I don't know how to make a framework, an intellectual framework, that will allow people easy access. Because it's not a meme. It's not a short thing. It might be a book, and sometime maybe I'll write the book, but I don't think I'm done enough to figure out what the book's supposed to be about yet. So after that, I kind of just absented myself from that conversation, because essentially the person was so triggered by me saying, I think the social credit score is really a box canyon way of thinking, that just shut everything off. And there was nothing for me saying, listen, it's not in. Now, again, we make a hypothesis and we see, and I could be wrong. I'm totally open to being wrong, but some of us have to make alternate hypotheses. So the resistance is saying authoritarianism, right? And rigid, structured, punitive stuff, right? So that's their position. They're in the 1984 position. My hypothesis is there will be elements of 1984 interspersed, right? That's Naomi Klein, the shock doctrine, even though she seems to have forgotten everything. There will be intermittent moments of authoritarian stress to recalibrate the system as it goes through. But for the most part, I feel like the larger chunks of time will be Brave New World. And it will be a game that they would like you to agree to play. And they will tell you a story that will validate you, whether that story is about you being libertarian or you being hippie, live off the grid, or whether that story is you being conservative Christian, or whether that's like, they will have a lot of different stories to tell you to get you to play their Milky Way project game with their digital wallet, right? And we can look and see that the resistance has been set up. It's you have all of these attention economy people, you have all of these specified uplifted influencers that have different flavors, and they do overlap in Venn diagrams, but they're different. And then once people get plugged into that, they've got the digital twin, they've got the Rockfin, and they can weave the story. My God, ChatGPT can probably weave the story. Now, the hysteria over AI, I think, in my opinion, is overblown, because clearly what they need is actually embodied distributed cognition to run their stupid quantum telepathic computer. The AI can't get into the field. The AI can't get in there. It can't. The kids can get in. The kids can get in. And I think they want people, because people, like, I don't know, I'm speculating at this point, but we're all over the world, right? And then the humans, I think we have a strong energy field, maybe not as strong as a horse, but we have a strong, and we interact with consciousness at a lot of different scales, from bacteria all the way to mountains, right? So we have this interface, and we have a consciousness that I think is probably unique on the planet. So if you're going to look for portals into the space, humans, and particularly human children, are that. And then I will just loop back. There's one more thing I wanted to say about the energy fields and the kids and the biocomputing is, this woman that used to blog in Maine, and she talked about her co-teacher in second grade. And again, second grade is that key age, right? 7, right? Because you start to lose your baby teeth right around then. And so the second graders, her co-teacher had brought in a project from UNICEF. Okay. So UNICEF Innovation, primarily funded by Disney, and I think Denmark and Sweden, or Finland and Denmark, maybe the two Scandinavian countries, right? And it's based at Singularity University. I think the Singularity is actually less about sentient AI and more about embedding us into the field. Okay. And that they would want the kids. So UNICEF Innovation, they had set up this program where the kids, the second graders, again, these impressionable children, were supposed to wear a Fitbit. And then depending on what the metrics were that they got for the day, then food packets would be delivered through UNICEF to starving children and somewhere else in the world. Now, there was one little boy who came up and said, tugged on the teacher's hand and said, well, if they have the food, why don't they just give it to the children? Right? Why don't they just give it to the children? And they are setting up, well, one, it was Impact Finance. And those Fitbits were branded by George Lucas for Star Wars, The Force, and run through Target. You could buy them independently, okay? And so if you look at what Klasanin is talking about and transpersonal psychology and guided media evolution and creating these bridges between global north, global south, and accessing the children, and creating these portals that would run through the MIT Media Lab. Now, Maine was a target of a lot of interventions from Seymour, I don't know if you say Papert or Papiert, from MIT Media Lab in computing. Okay, so Seymour Papier retired to Maine. Now, Angus King and Olympia Snow, who were legislators, prominent national level legislators, I can't remember, senators or whatever, in Maine, deeply involved in E-Rate, which is the subsidized digital connection to libraries and schools. And Maine was the launch point after Chugach, Alaska, for competency-based education. Right. So I think Maine is this test bed. And then another friend at the same time had said, that Maine was with Papier and Angus King. They were connected. They were the first state to do one-on-one laptops back in the day. So I think they were maybe the U.S. equivalent of Negroponte's One Laptop, One Child program. And Maine is pretty poor, right? So they came in, they gave all the kids laptops. They were guinea pigs. Now, this is a number of years later, maybe 10 years later, and they're coming back and they created a whole new school. Another person told me about the creation of a whole new school in her community, and her child is in high school. And the first time around that they did stuff with competency-based education, they gave all the kids iPads, which iPads you can't create on an iPad. You can't type an essay on an iPad. You literally, it is a programming device. It is an entrainment and programming device. It is an electromagnetic field device. It's a radiation device, right? That's what it's a portal, just like the Diamond Age. It's a tutoring. It's here is going to show up your AI tutor, your life coach tutor. Now, that wasn't the first round of iPads. And there was a big debacle about crappy money being spent on these crappy iPads and them not lasting and not working. But now they built this new school. For 2 years, they had laptops. Now at the Christmas, they're taking away the laptops and they're giving iPads back. Now, iPads, this is what's important, is the content on these digital devices is linked, they're data units, right? So just like your consciousness is being programmed by what comes through your feed, drip, 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 and there's metadata tags on that to keep track on your digital twin bit, that's what personalized learning is, right? That your personalized edtech playlist of education. On a laptop, they had something called SCORM, SCORM, Shareable Content Object Reference Module, but it was limited. You couldn't track on iPads, wearables, or phones. Now, this XAPI technology was developed by the military. It was developed for military training, and it was developed for measurable behavior change with transmedia learning. That's what the woman Elaine Rayborn of Sandia National Labs measurable behavior change. It was all tracked through XAPI technology, or also called Tin Can API. So I really believe that the shift for high school kids to take away their laptops at this brand new fancy high school, supposedly they spent like $1 million on a snack center or something, and then hand a high school senior an iPad and tell them to finish out the school year on an iPad. What kind of education is that? And I think the education is really ultimately going to be, it's not even going to be an iPad, it's going to be a smart uniform and expeditionary learning. And that, but you will have something. You will have a wearable, you will have your coach, your Jane from Ender's Game along, and then it will be creating this consciousness field. So anyway, I mean, I wanted to say this today because I'm at a loss. I have empathy for people who are trying to follow along and they're like, I can't possibly spend as much time as you spend sorting through all of this and coming up with a storyline. And maybe some people think that this seems like a preposterous storyline. You're entitled to think it's a preposterous storyline. I mean, at some point in the next 10 or 15 years, it might be useful that somebody said this online, that this is my hypothesis, that not only are they building an ant computer, but they're going to use, nano self-assembling neural nanobots to create a telepathic ant computer using the world's children, through the UN. And maybe that'll sound crazy. At least somebody said it, and we'll just see. Like, that's how it works, right? You make an hypothesis and then you test it. So, and again, all of this out of school time stuff, that's going to totally, the whole John Taylor Gatto and libertarian and all the stuff, like, you think this stuff isn't going to be in the freedom cells? Totally. They're going to be selling it. Like, the freedom cells are going to be branding. I mean, look at Derek Bros. Like, he was already pushing crypto play to earn gaming on Mexican kids. So, just, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to do it better. I think the frustration, and I think the response of this person when I said, when you throw out social credit score, which honestly, I did the Chinese social credit score for a year, like when I was doing ed tech before I was understanding blockchain. But it's before I actually realized that the social credit score came from FICO, and those guys were out of Stanford in the 50s. We developed the social credit score, right? It's homegrown. And so the consciousness circuit is China's social credit score is just, in my mind, it is a box cannon. I mean, I guess we can debate. You're totally entitled to be in a box cannon if you find that way of thinking opens up more and more and more doors to understand in a deeper way. Or if you understand it as, this is my way of categorizing something and not dealing with it in a deeper way because I just don't have the capacity to deal with it in a deeper way, that's fine. But I didn't think that was a really super mean thing to say. It's like, I think that the Chinese social credit score is a box canyon idea because I think they've been given it. I think this is a groove. This is a template in the collective thought form of the resistance, is to say this over and over and over, like, you will own nothing and you will be happy, or whatever. Those things are egregores that are given to us. And I think like, that's what the World Economic Forum is. It's a mouthpiece for mind templating of the resistance, to short circuit them so that they're not looking at Gordana Vitaliano and her neural nanobots and addiction treatment and subconscious processing and understanding what that might mean for RFK Jr.'s San Patrignano program, right? It keeps you in a template. And, probably most people are going to be okay in a template. I'm not saying most people maybe don't want to be outside the template. That's okay. You don't have to be. I keep saying I'm weird. And if I had a better language to talk about it, like if I had some sort of symbolic hieroglyphics of these concepts, I would use it. Totally. If I had my semiotics were better, I would use them. I think some people, they think I'm doing it to be difficult. I'm making it harder than it has to be because I'm just trying to be difficult with people, or make them feel stupid or something. I'm not. I never did this before. I never thought I would have to do this. And I'm, I don't mean to be on here as like some sort of ego builder, like I'm some special person to do this. I just feel like I have a responsibility. Because in 2018, I knew that William Haidt was with Ridge Lane. And I have a friend who we're in the same problem space, and she's facing up against some pretty intense energies in Dallas, and she knows. And we have a responsibility not to make them the evil bad guys. I had a good exchange with somebody the other day, because I think our tendency is always to like slot it into evil or uncomfortable or bad, and then move on and position ourselves so we're on the good side and that's on the bad side. And increasingly, if this thing is a field, and like I would prefer to imagine it as a field of the divine that's trying to make us better. Playing around a little bit with the idea of the heyoka and the sacred clown, and like maybe doing things that is kind of uncomfortable sometimes. I mean, I'm not trying to be culturally appropriative, but I don't have a thought form that applies, and that feels kind of interesting. I've been playing around with magical realism and heyoka, and if the field has a divine element, then would it make a win-lose scenario? If ultimately maybe it's the universe experiencing itself through all our characters, I'm like, hey, you got to be the, weird mom that was like the researcher that time. Oh, I got to be this character, right? And then like we switch some other time, right? Yeah, I I see there's someone who's just like talking about just say no. And if you're there, then like you can just go away. Like, yeah, you don't have to be. I'm figuring it out. And maybe eventually I'll figure it out that like really what I just need to do is go walk in the woods and be on a kayak. And that might be my future. But for now, anyway, I'm telling this story. And if there's ways of interpreting it better, if we can collectively build a curriculum, if we can build a language, if we can make art around this to make this more understandable. But I don't think it's that hard. Like ultimately the shorthand version is they are templating consciousness to tell us stories that will get us to accept participating in a multidimensional, possibly nonlinear time game where our relationality and our beingness in the world and the way in which our energy fields interact with one another and the world around us and the other beings is part of some sort of larger computing process, and that we're nodes in that, and I don't know to what end. I don't know what end that is. So that's how I'm describing it now. And I'm I think it's an interesting way to think about it. I'm not saying it's definitely right. But I think as long as we're thinking about kids and education choice and wearables and gaming, it's something to keep in mind. So, yeah, I think that's all the last thing. Oh, the last thing is, again, serendipitously, a woman that I used to organize with who sent me an email. We haven't been in touch for a while, but she was talking about ARPA education, like a DARPA for education. And they were ramping up some RFP or RFI for more ed tech stuff. And it was through something called IES, I can't remember, something education system. I don't remember what the I stands for, but it's a government. Essentially, it's the pass through of the government money for education systems and moving all into ed tech. And I remembered at the time, I have a map, like I have this mind map, and I make them all available for people for free, but it's not going to stay in your consciousness the way it stays in mine because I made it, right? Like it's just, I think, no judgment there. It's just the process of making it cements it in your consciousness in a different way than just looking at it. But I'm more than happy, and I've been very, I think, pretty generous about sharing all my material, all my source material. So you can look at it and decide for yourself if it makes sense, or see where things plug into your own lines of research, or just imagine that it's all bunk, yeah, so IES was in one of my maps, and it was my Neo World map, KNEO World. And at the time, this guy, Franklin Lieberman, he was fronting this company, and it was being developed all around the world. He was from Long Island, and he was connected to the Brooklyn NAACP, and they were doing piloting for special education students. And it was a behavioral management program. And it was a game. It was on an app. It was on a phone, because I think the phone-based stuff is more consciousness steering, like the portability. But it was developed. It was piloted in China. It was developed in part with participation from game designers in Scotland and Indonesia. And then the research on it was done, I think, at Monash University in Australia. So it was a very global project. And IES was hooked in, and actually it was targeting homeschoolers. So they had a homeschool component, and they had like, it was connected to Facebook, and it was connected to CASEL, so social emotional learning. And I will say the one thing about the remote viewing, when I was looking at some of these remote viewing videos, I guess you have someone who's working with a target, and then you have a recorder and a coach. And the person, I guess, who was coaching kept saying, "How are you feeling? How are you feeling?" Like a lot. And I guess maybe that's part of the process, being in touch with your like mental state. And I'm realizing that Haidt, our superintendent, was also doing work at Yale in the Yale School of Management with the Broad Institute. And Yale was connected to, they had an early child psychiatry program in 1911. And I believe it was backed by the Rockefellers. It was funded by the Rockefellers, child psychiatry. And they also have this child study center. I think the child psychiatry is part of the School of Medicine, but they had an emotional intelligence system it's directly connected into social emotional learning. And they actually had something called Ruler, which is a funny name, to manage their educational system, like their emotional compass. So you were supposed to, and so when I'm seeing this guy doing remote viewing, they're like, "How are you feeling? How are you feeling?" I'm like, wow, I think that this idea of mindfulness, meditation, executive function, being in touch with measuring emotion might have something to do with remote viewing. So, so Yale was also linked in with this IES and the CASEL. And so, to me, I have like these broad signals, like these signals are coming through the field at me. And then my challenge is to how to sort through them in a way that makes sense and find a pattern. And again, I guess people can debate whether or not there's actually a pattern or how strong of a pattern or a signal. I have a lot of pins and things. I have a lot of these maps, and they're across time and space and individuals, and that they help me think through things. And it's probably unlikely that there's going to be a lot of people out there who are doing the same thing, who have the time to do the same thing, who have the inclination to do the same thing. Like it takes a certain kind of way of being, sitting here in this chair for hours and hours a day, doing that. And then once I do it, to what end? Because I don't know. Like I don't really know to what end. So anyway, I don't mean to piss people off, but I do want people to be more mindful about templating and how our minds are being templated, and how we can practice being flexible in our thinking, and taking in new information and reconsidering, and maybe not defaulting to shorthand ideas that don't fully serve us. And with that said, everybody's entitled to choose. Everybody's entitled to choose how they do it. And people can certainly say, I like using templates. It's convenient, and it makes me feel like part of the group. So I'm going to stick with that. And that's certainly you're right, but I might suggest that there's other ways. So anyway, the psychic ant computer running on children's imaginations through early childhood impact investing. I guess that's it for the day. Make sense of that, why don't you? With the neural nanobots. But anyway, and thank you for people who are, who are interested in playing with this and who send things my way. And I can't always process it all immediately. And I think we, like I said, we're all human. So putting this out there with hopefully like a well-intentioned frequency. I'm not like here to like finger wag. I'm just here to process it for myself, because I'm also like, I have to navigate my own triggers in this. And my own triggers are at this point wondering if anyone will ever get me, will ever actually get what I'm trying to say. And that if I should just keep doing it anyway, because maybe I'm playing with the sacred clown of the field and I put a pebble in and we don't know where it goes. So anyway, thanks for hanging out in this impromptu chat. And Jason and I think we've recorded at least 10 more hours on Arkansas. And we haven't even gotten into the state of Arkansas. So I'm sure, I'm very grateful for him, the resources he's putting into editing these. And again, it's kind of ridiculous. Like I can't, again, Sometimes I've been saying, I need to say it long before I can say it short. So if you want to stick around for the long version, you're welcome. Maybe in a couple years, I'll get around to the short version and write the book that needs to be written. I'm just not there yet. So anyway, bye guys.